Hello everyone, my name is Graham Davis and I'm the Director of Research for the Department of Politics here at the University of York. On behalf of the department, I'd like to welcome you all. We are delighted to host the first annual Adrian Leftwich Memorial Lecture at York. The lecture commemorates our friend and colleague, Professor Adrian Leftwich. After his death in 2013, our friends at the Global Development Institute in Manchester got together to convene a lecture in his memory. We were naturally very pleased that they invited us to take over the series in 2019. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues Neil, Claire, Phil, Mina, and of course Indrajit, who brought this prestigious series back to us at York. Adrian's work spanned the domains of politics and development studies. Therefore, it's only fitting that today's speaker, Professor Prerna Singh, also straddles both disciplines. Best known for her work in comparative politics of welfare provision, Professor Singh has shaped emerging debates on ethnicity, nationalism, and development. I'll leave my colleague Indrajit to introduce Professor Singh in greater detail, but before that, my colleague Neil Carter would like to say a few things about Adrian. Neil, over to you.
Thanks very much, Graham. Adrian was a much loved and much missed colleague in the Department of Politics here at York. He studied for his PhD in the department and then became a lecturer back in the 1970s. Later, he left the department around about 2008 in his mid to late 60s, making very clear to me, I remember, that he was moving on. He wasn't retiring. He was moving on in a new career direction. And he went to work for Australian Aid and particularly as Director of Research on the Development Leadership Programme, with the aim of trying to apply his expertise to more, if you like, practical issues. Adrian's interests were wide-ranging. He was incredibly well-read across the discipline of politics, but he specialised in development studies, and he published many books, articles, chapters, including The Development State, States of Development, Democracy and Development, and Redefining Politics. Adrian wanted his work to have practical application to development policy and practice, to aid effectiveness, and ultimately to help the lives of poor and disadvantaged people. Adrian's target was to challenge international aid orthodoxy. He sought to help bring politics back in. That was one of his mantras, bring politics back in, and to advance our understanding of development as a fundamentally political process. And in doing so, he pioneered the idea of the development state. And that wish to bring politics back in reflected Adrian's interest in exploring the nature of our discipline of politics or political science. He edited a book, What is Politics, back in the 1980s, which with contributions from then members of the politics department. Later on, he edited a second edition of that book in 2004, and I was honoured to be asked to write a chapter on the environment in that book. And that book is still widely used across the globe for particularly undergraduate students to introduce them to the idea of what politics is as a discipline and to think about how you might study politics from a range of different perspectives. Adrian was also the most fantastic teacher, inspiring, engaging, and also a little bit frightening to students. Why? Because in the days of paper module guides, of reading lists, Adrian would deliver reading lists that looked and weighed like bricks. He expected his students to read vast amounts on a weekly basis. And this was a problem for the rest of us teaching alongside Adrian. You know, we expected our students to read the normal amount of reading for each weekly seminar. But we got used to that apology from our students. Oh, sorry, I haven't read this week. I haven't done the reading this week because I had to read Adrian's. And they were terrified of not reading Adrian's, and Adrian, of course, took priority. And yet they adored him. If I bump into former students of the politics department at York, anywhere around, it's their memory of Adrian that has really stayed with them, and his wonderful, deep, resonant voice. And I've travelled many countries of the world, lucky to do so in my job, and whenever I meet fellow academics, fellow political scientists, as soon as you say, oh, I'm from the University of York, the first person they would say was, oh yeah, Adrian Leftwich was there, wasn't he? And finally, on a personal note, Adrian was a good friend and a lovely colleague, and he immediately made me feel at home when I first came to the department many years ago. And we remained good friends after he left the university to work for the Development Leaders Programme. My daughter, then aged about 7, used to go and do piano every week next door to Adrian. So I used to park myself in Adrian's kitchen while we discussed the world's problems. And then he'd spoil my daughter with biscuits and juice when she came in. She and I both miss him greatly. So I'm really delighted that here at York we can honour Adrian's memory with this in his legacy with this annual lecture, which is happening in no small part because of my colleague Indrajit. And over to Indrajit to introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Graham. I'm really happy that our speaker today is quite inspiring and quite engaging. I'm not sure how frightening she is, but that's, I suppose, something we should ask her students. But I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Prerna Singh, who's the Mahatma Gandhi Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies, with appointments in the School of Public Health and the Department of Sociology at Brown University. Prerna has published numerous award-winning books and articles on human development, public health, ethnicity, and nationalism. Her first book, How Solidarity Works for Welfare, was awarded the Best Book Prize from both the American Political Science Association as well as the American Sociological Association. Prerna has been awarded fellowships by the Center for Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, the Social Science Research Council, the Andrew Carnegie Foundation, the American Academy of Berlin, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies, and the American Institute of Indian Studies. I'm sure I could go on, but I'll stop here. She shared her research with scholarly, policy, and popular audiences through over 100 lectures that include keynote addresses delivered across some 20-odd countries. Prerna serves on the academic advisory board of the Harvard Yenching Institute. She is a steering committee on the Center for the Contemporary South Asian Studies at Brown, is a fellow at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and co-convenes the very prestigious and well-attended Brown-Harvard-MIT Joint Seminar in South Asian Politics. Prerna is also on the editorial board of Cambridge University Press's Elements in the Politics of Development series. So that's for everyone to know. And over the next 2 years, she will serve as president of the Comparative Politics section, which is the largest section of the American Political Science Association. At the moment, Prerna is working on 2 single-authored book projects. One explores the potential construction and consequences of an inclusive nationalism. The second, on which I suspect a lot of today's material will draw, develops a moral theory of popular compliance with public health interventions, such as vaccination, and where I can hardly overstate the relevance of the topic, through a comparison of China and India from the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. So Prerna will speak for 45 odd minutes. We will have time for question and answers thereafter. So please do put any questions or comments you have into the Q&A box over the next few minutes. And with that, over to you, Prerna.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind invitation. And really thank you for the honor to be delivering this lecture with you today. And it was really wonderful to be able to hear a little bit more than I already knew about Adrian Leftwich. So thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen and assume that you can see it. Great. So I'll be sharing today a set of thoughts around what are coalescing around what I've begun to call a moral theory of development. And before going any further, it's useful to begin to think, what do we mean by development? And here, drawing on Amartya Sen's influential conceptualization, we can think of development as consisting of 3 distinct, interrelated and mutually reinforcing types of development: economic, political, and social. But most of my talk today will really be focusing on social development, which can range from the provision of affordable housing and sanitation, drinking water. But my specific focus will be public health, the control of infectious diseases, as well as education and healthcare more broadly. Indrajit mentioned in his very generous introduction that I am jointly appointed across a number of departments, but my disciplinary training is as a comparative political scientist. And comparative politics is a subdiscipline that is brought together by a method, and the method is that of comparison. And so my study of social development has really been driven by a study of comparisons of the variations in social development. And even though we've made huge strides in the last century and a half, today we are characterized by stark inequities in a range of social development indicators across the world. So just for instance, to look at maternal mortality, which is the likelihood of a mother dying during the course of childbirth, you can see stark variations across the world and then even within the same part of the world. So, if you're a mother giving birth in Chad, you're 40 times more likely to die during labor than if you're in adjacent Egypt. And even within the US, which is a country that has actually seen a really distressing rise in maternal mortality rates, especially for women from some of the most marginalized and impoverished parts of the US, you can see that difference even subnationally. You're 5 times more likely to die during childbirth in Georgia as compared to the state of California. And so much of my research has really been driven by trying to understand these variations in social development. And just to present to you at the beginning, a highly stylized model of how it is that we get to social development, we can think of this in terms of top-down and bottom-up mechanisms. So at the top-down, it's very important that states prioritize and institute social policy, but we also need to see popular cooperation and compliance with these public goods and services, and both together would then lead to higher levels of social development. Now, when we think a little about what are our dominant understandings of both these top-down and bottom-up mechanisms, I want to contend that both of these mechanisms are really driven by an understanding, the dominant explanations are really driven by an understanding of humans as rational actors, what has been termed Homo economicus. So the fact that we try to maximize our narrow interest cost benefit calculations, we act instrumentally, we act strategically. And I'll talk you through just briefly how it is that this assumption of humans as rational interest maximizers drives both dominant explanations for why states institute social policies. So think for a second of the dominant explanations. States will put in place social policies if they are richer, so they can afford to do so. Or they'll do so in democracies, but the mechanism is if they do not, then they will be held accountable at the ballot box. They will risk losing office. A similar logic that higher levels of political competition will again make it more costly for political leaders to ignore collective welfare. Another similar logic also underlies class politics, that you will put in place social policy because otherwise class-based movements will hold your feet to the fire. Again, pushback, popular protest, but also this risk of losing office at the ballot box. And finally, an influential class of arguments that I have tried in other work that Indrajit mentioned to argue against is that if there is a greater level of ethnic diversity, well, then political leaders will find it more rational to put in place club goods that are targeted to particular ethnic groups rather than to put in place public health or overall education policies that are for the welfare of all. So these dominant explanations are all driven by this underlying assumption that humans are strategic, instrumental actors. You can see this also if we try to understand what it is that drives popular cooperation with state directives. And again, as Indrajit said, I'll be talking a lot about vaccination today, but even if we think more broadly of under what conditions do people comply with social services, it's a very similar logic. that people comply if they're given incentives, so the benefits are raised. Similarly, by giving them information that changes their cost-benefit calculation. And finally, if they're punished or it is made compulsory. So, these are the conditions: incentives, information, or compulsion or coercion, which are again driven by this underlying understanding of humans as rational actors. And yet we know that we are less than rational. The existence of cognitive biases is well known in social psychology. Someone like Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, of course, is a psychologist, along with Amor Tversky, has shown the number of biases: availability bias, confirmation bias, the fact that we discount the future. These are all biases that humans have to live with. So we're less than rational. And this goes against rational actor understandings. But really what I want to focus on today is that we're also more than rational. We are moral. And we know these from experiments going back to babies who are 8 months old, who prefer a puppet who does good stuff as compared to an evil puppet. We see it again by the time they're 18 months, that they will offer a toy or pat a mother in distress on her back. And so I want to begin with this understanding of humans as moral actors, and what has in recent work by people like Anne-Marie Slaughter, Hilary Cotton, Margaret Levy, and of course it goes back further. They call it sapiens integra, the fact that we have a more broad, integrated understanding of human behavior, and in particular homo moralis, the fact that we are driven by moral motivations. And we can think of these moral motivations as norms, as values, as beliefs, as worldviews, as ideas of trust, legitimacy, authority, as emotions, and also in terms of shared identities and solidarities. And so all of these, we know from research across anthropology, neuroscience, sociology, behavioral economics, we know that these are important motivations. And I want to think through today, what does it mean to try to develop an understanding of social development that is driven more by homo moralis than by homo economicus. And just to take you through the rest of the talk, the structure of the talk very quickly, I'll try to develop this moral theory of development across different outcomes in different empirical and temporal contexts. And so I'll do it in my first case study by looking at the control of contagion, particularly through compliance of vaccination, with the world's first vaccine across Chinese and Indian cities. And also I'll briefly talk about the comparison of China and India. And much of my work is historically rooted. And so this will be taking you from around the turn of the 19th century into the mid-20th century. And this will focus more on the second bottom-up mechanism, which is how can we think of a moral theory of popular cooperation with public goods and services. And then hopefully in the second half of the talk, I'll talk about education and health more broadly, kind of building out from the control of contagion. And this time the variation I'll be looking at will be within India, subnational variation. And again, we'll begin around the mid-19th century into the 20th century. And here in the second part of it, I will be focusing more on the moral motivations for why it is that state elites institute social policy. And so between these two empirical hubs, hopefully I'll be able to put forward for you a theory of the moral motivations for development that looks both at this top-down as well as this bottom-up mechanism for better well-being. So let's begin with this idea of the control of contagion in China and India, which, as Indrajit mentioned, is a book that I have been working on for some years, for far too many years, and hopefully it'll be in your hands before too long. And because I began this when I did, I needed to begin by saying that why is it that we need to study the control of contagion as an important component of human welfare, which of course is not something I necessarily need to do today, but I still think it's beyond COVID to think about the fact that infectious diseases have posed a threat to mankind pretty much from the beginning of settled agriculture and the domestication of animals. They have been the single largest cause of human morbidity and mortality. And in addition to this existential threat to the human race, they have led to social and political tumult, the collapse of mighty empires. For instance, here in the New World, we know that much of the indigenous empires were wiped out by infectious diseases brought by the colonists into this virgin territory. And today we continue, again, the ongoing pandemic is only the most stark indicator of our continued vulnerability, despite massive interventions, antibiotics, vaccines, through the last couple of centuries, we still remain highly vulnerable to both naturally occurring viruses, as well as possibly the use of germs as a tool of bioterrorism. So when we think about the control of contagion, I just want to kind of briefly, from a kind of political science, sociological point of view, we know that the most famous dictum for how it is that states were made is that it was the process of making war that made states, the necessity to mobilize finances, people, that led to the building of the state apparatus. And yet I want to contend that in as much as it was war that made states, according to Charles Taylor's famous dictum, it is really more, to continue a militarization metaphor that's quite popular, it is war against disease that made states. So think about how institutions of control, these were civil organizations, police, customs, migration, the surveillance of people and goods and services, quarantines, these were all institutions of control, state institutions that were necessitated by the control of contagion. And in as much as it was these bureaucratic institutions of control that came into being because of the need to control germs, also institutions of care, and the two developed hand in hand. So on the one hand, there was quarantines and the kind of forcible removal of people and goods. On the other hand, it was the idea of welfare, of poor laws, and of a range of other institutions that are almost proto-institutions for the welfare state that developed in response to the need to control germs. And this state incursion, this development of these institutions led the state to really begin to displace what were previously societal responsibilities. So religious, kinship, charitable, civil society associations were really responsible for the bodies and the souls of their flock. And the state coming in really displaced these institutions such that it gradually progressed. The control of diseases and the provision of health gradually progressed from being recognized as within the jurisdiction of the state to then being seen as a key obligation and responsibility of the state towards its people, such that state capacity itself begins to be measured in terms of the health of its people. And this is a famous quote by Roosevelt, that the success or failure of any government must be measured by the well-being of its citizens, and nothing is more important to a state than public health. And so I want to kind of set the stage for why it is that I really begin from states as the key actors. And so in the moral theory of development, it is really, even though we know local communities are very important, it is really about state control of disease, state provision of education and health, and then popular cooperation or lack thereof with these state interventions. And so this idea of the state as a key actor in development, however, requires a certain typology of state capacity. And so just to kind of, very briefly, let's think a little about, what is it that states have historically done and that we expect them to do today. And I want to put forward this typology that I've been working on for a while, in which I think you can think about state tasks in terms of a key distinction. And that is, to what extent is it necessary for society to be on board? And I would argue that there are a certain set of tasks, think of economic growth or macroeconomic policy, fiscal planning, the dispensation of justice, and within the public goods provision arena, we can think of the building of public infrastructure. So whether that's schools or airports or canals, these kinds of policies require relatively minimal societal participation. But on the other hand, there is another set of tasks, which I list here in the second column, in which a state is only as capable as its ability to gain societal compliance. And so let's think about conducting a census or elections or collecting taxes or raising an army. In these cases, you really require people to come out and vote. You require people to volunteer for an army or not dodge the draft in a conscription. And in particular, in public goods provision, education, healthcare, public health in particular, we can see it starkly today. A state's ability to be able to control disease is only as, it's only as successful as people coming on board with these state directives, and in particular, vaccine hesitancy, which has been a problem before the COVID vaccine. It was rated as one of the top 10 threats to global health back in 2009 by the WHO. So we can see in vaccine hesitancy how a state's capacity is curtailed by the unwillingness of society to come on board. And this is the question that I'm really interested in, is under what conditions and how can we encourage popular compliance with state directives towards the larger cause of promoting well-being? And just to say that this, why vaccines, they've been the single most important intervention in public health. And they have, as a single intervention, they have protected more children and adults from untimely death than any other form of medical treatment. The first vaccine was against smallpox, which was one of the oldest and deadliest diseases to afflict mankind. This is the first known evidence we have, which is a mummy of King Ramses V. But it's not only one of history's oldest killers and deadliest killers, it's also the site of the world's most triumphant achievement, in that it's so far the only human disease that we have been able to eradicate. We continue to try with polio, but so far smallpox eradication through the global dissemination of the smallpox vaccine is our only human disease to be eradicated. Now, because I'll be comparing China and India, it makes for an interesting comparison, because these are the two countries that compete for this colonial moniker of the cradles of smallpox. They both have long histories of smallpox. They have similar theories of causation, visitation by a disease deity, which is not peculiar to China and India. Europe had its share of disease deities at the time, but this is the Indian smallpox goddess Sitala and the Chinese smallpox goddess Toshan Nyang. In addition to the worship of these goddesses, smallpox had an elaborate set of dietary rules and prohibited behavior that was associated with this disease. And I just want to spend a little minute here on what was the prophylactic practice that was very successful in the control of smallpox prior to the invention of the smallpox vaccine, and indeed that formed the basis for the vaccine. So in order to understand variolation, or inoculation as it was termed, it's easiest to think about how vaccines work. So in most vaccines, not the mRNA vaccines in the Pfizer Moderna today, but for instance, even in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and in most other vaccines preceding this, we are exposed to a relatively harmless and attenuated version of a virus through an injection, through a vaccine, so that we can develop an immunity to it, so that we have a response to it, such that when we encounter this virus out in the world, we are less likely to have a more severe infection from that virus. So this knowledge, this logic of how vaccines work comes from the knowledge of variolation. And in variolation, which developed by most scholars independently in China and India around the 16th century, children were exposed, because this smallpox was a primarily childhood disease. In fact, it was so terrible. And when I, as a child, as a mother of a child, I always find this so hard to believe, is that children were not named in India and China until they had recovered from smallpox. So that tells you some idea of just what a feared disease this was. But children would usually be exposed to old smallpox scabs. So in India, a tikadar would come along, and tika, which is also the word for vaccine, actually meant that this tikadar, a variolator, would have collected old smallpox scabs, maybe 2 seasons ago, from a relatively minor infection. And in India would introduce it, usually in your upper arm, quite similar to a vaccine. The technology was very similar. In China, you would usually do this through nasal insufflation. So the idea that you might snort smallpox scabs. And we know the nasal membrane is very porous. It's also the way that people snort cocaine. So the idea that you would snort these smallpox scabs, but in both the logic is the same. By being exposed to this, very controlled case of a relatively harmless, attenuated version of the human smallpox virus, you develop an immunity to it. And this was a very successful, I will argue also slightly dangerous, because the problem was you still remained contagious in the way that you're not when you receive a vaccine. But this was very successful. It was introduced to the West by a very courageous woman. There's a great website called Women You Should Know, and they have a lovely cartoon about her. But to the ridicule and opposition of many men, she introduced variolation via Constantinople to the UK and Europe, and it led to important increases in mortality from smallpox. Variolation was the basis for Edward Jenner, who was usually considered the inventor of the world's first vaccine. Jenner himself was variolated, but he brought together the knowledge of variolation with the folk wisdom that cowpox maidens were some of the most successful, most beautiful, most coveted brides in England at the time, in Europe more broadly. And he realized that the reason why cow maidens were so beautiful is because they did not get smallpox. And the reason they did not get smallpox is because they got cowpox, which was a quite awful disease. I understand if you were a cow, but a quite benign disease if you were a human. And so these cow maidens who contracted cowpox were immune from smallpox. And so variola vaccinae, which coins the term vaccine itself, literally means vaccination from the cow. And so Jenner's invention was to take the logic and technique of variolation, but to replace the human smallpox matter with matter of cowpox. And so that's why the term variola vaccinae. Of course, you can see on the poster on the right is that this, the fact that it was from the cow also formed the basis for early anti-vaccine movements. And you can see the idea was that because this is from the cow, if you get vaccinated, you will begin to sprout horns and hooves. And so, resistance to vaccine is as old as the world's first vaccine. So this vaccine, which really built on native indigenous knowledge from China and India, was now cloaked in colonial benevolence and taken back to China and India at around exactly the same time by the same actor. And so the book is really structured around these comparisons of the smallpox vaccine from the time of the invention of the vaccine to the time of the eradication in 1975. So just going through this just a little bit quicker in the next few minutes. If you think about what is the Homo economicus theory of why people should accept vaccines, it is incentives, it's information, and it's compulsion, because these are the strategic ways that people will make decisions of whether or not to get vaccinated or not. And yet we know, this is a cover from the New Yorker on the left of a few years ago, in which they talked about how science is not changing minds, how vaccine myth busting can actually backfire. So we know that clearly information does not change our mind. We also know that coercion is hardly ever effective, and actually, if anything, can have a backlash. In India, one of the few, I think perhaps the only, I hesitate to say this in a department such as York, which has such wonderful historians of India, and particularly people like Sanjay Bhattacharya, who actually work on vaccination in India. But my understanding is that the only standing British official who was assassinated in colonial India was actually the plague commissioner of Pune, and that had to do with public health restrictions that were introduced, coercive, draconian interventions by the British colonial government. What I have here for you is something called a vaccine revolt that happened in Rio de Janeiro at the turn of the 20th century. But this shows you the limits of coercion as a strategy to convince people, and I think this is relevant today, especially as we are beginning to think about going beyond vaccine mandates. So I want to move away from these theories of incentives, information, and coercion to instead suggest that very important to popular compliance with public health directives are people's moral motivations, and in particular, this idea of who is it that is asking for compliance and how is compliance being elicited? How is it framed? What is it that compliance is being sought for? And to put it just in broad theoretical terms, we were more likely historically to take up vaccines if they commanded trust, authority, and legitimacy. And that's the messenger part of it. And if they aligned with our values, beliefs, worldviews, and tradition. This is also linked to scholarship in social psychology that talks about how the familiar is more likely to be palatable and taken on board. And so this idea of cognitive consonance, a kind of cognitive link. Leon Festinger, a sociologist, has talked about it. Daniel Kahneman has spoken about this as well. So we are more likely to take vaccines if, rather than being presented as something brand new, they're actually aligned and do not constitute a rupture with our existing worldviews, traditions, beliefs, cultural mores, and norms. Another way that we can think about the message is if it taps into our ideas of solidarity, community, and we-ness. And so we can think about the message as being cognitively consonant, but also affectively motivating. And both of these, I argue, I classify them within this broader argument about moral motivations. So just very quickly, Indrajit, if you might be able to just put into the chat the link, because I won't have a chance to go into this, but in the book, the book is structured around comparisons of cities and provinces in China and India, but I'll just take you very quickly through Calcutta and Canton. Those were the colonial names for Kolkata and Guangzhou. And these, just from this map, you can tell, very important for public health. They share very similar climactic and therefore epidemiological conditions. And so this, in the chat, you have access to a link to a document that tries to put together the similarities in service of a most similar case design, going back to John Stuart Mill, for why it is that Calcutta and Canton form a good basis for comparison, a good paired comparison. But as I mentioned, the key thing to remember is that the East India Company, the same actor, introduces the vaccine to Canton and Calcutta within a couple of years. In fact, Canton has a head start. These are cities that are very similar in terms of geographic, demographic conditions, large growing cities, politically powerful cities, key entrepôts in the British Empire. In fact, trade between Canton, Calcutta, and London is really the lifeblood of British colonialism, starts with tea and goes to then opium. And just to give you a sense of this, I couldn't help just putting this painting. It's a mediocre piece of art, I've been assured by anyone who knows anything about art, but it's a painting of the Money brothers, which of course cracks me up. And what's interesting, of course, is the fingers of Robert Money. Their father was also in the employ of the East India Company, so were all three brothers. And you see the youngest and the middle brother here pointing their fingers to Canton and Calcutta, which gives you an indication of the relevance of these two cities to British imperialism and the fortunes of the East India Company at this time. So the key difference, of course, is that despite these similarities, Canton has a very high rate of vaccination by the mid-19th century, and Calcutta remains abysmal. Of course, there are prominent alternate explanations, including subaltern studies, schools' explanations for why the vaccine was resisted in Calcutta compared to Canton, and I would be happy to talk through these more in the Q&A, but I want to just put forward, in again the interests of time, the argument that I have found through my archival evidence that the vaccine in Canton was more likely to be accepted because it was espoused by the gentry who commanded for many centuries before the trust, authority, and legitimacy. The gentry were state officials, but they were also people who might not hold official positions, but had passed the civil service examination. As well as in southern China in the late Qing, merchants had gentry status, and they held this very unique position, which I don't think there really is an analogy in India, between state and society. They concentrated political socio-economic power. They were representatives of the state, but they were also close to society, and they commanded these relationships. They were embedded in these relationships of trust, authority, and legitimacy. And so they are the ones who really espoused and endorsed the vaccine. And they did this in a way that was culturally resonant and cognitively consonant. And so, as I mentioned, the vaccine is new, but smallpox is not new. Smallpox has been around for centuries at this point in time. And it has a very established, in many ways, a quite elaborate, cohesive, and sophisticated set of treatments, of which variolation is perhaps the most sophisticated. And what happens in Canton, but as I will show you very quickly, does not happen in Calcutta, is that this new vaccine from Jenner, from England, gets integrated within the existing etiologies and treatments of smallpox. And the way in which this happens is through this blockbuster of a manual. It has almost 68 different editions, which is technically a translation of a vaccine manual written by Alexander Pearson, who was the Surgeon General of the East India Company in Macau, which is where the vaccine originally came. Shi is one of his apprentices who writes what is technically a translation, but really it's an exercise in embedding. It's an exercise in the vernacularization and sinicization of vaccination. So what does Shi do? He completely removes any reference to the British or English origin of the vaccine. So the original treatise is called An Extraordinary History of a New Method of Inoculation Discovered in the Kingdom of England. There's no need for that. He gets rid of that entirely. Instead, he rewrites this book. Remember, there's no theory to how vaccine works. Jenner's is an observation. And that lack of a theory is also the reason why Jenner gets a lot of pushback within the medical establishment in England at this time, is because he doesn't really know how the vaccine works. All he knows is that it works, and it's this observation. So Shi decides to add a theory of how vaccination works, and he does that by going back to kind of traditional Chinese medicine theories of how smallpox works, which is that it is a fetal toxin because it's a childhood disease. Children are too innocent to build up sin, so it is a toxin that's inherited from your parents. It's a fetal toxin, taidu. And he adds this theory in. He also keeps all the pre and post-op dietary and ritual protocols in both China and India. Smallpox was a heating disease, a disease of heat. And so a cooling protocol was adopted, and he said that that should accompany vaccination. It had traditionally accompanied variolation. And he also added and kept a lot of traditional Chinese medicine herbal formulas that used to accompany the technology of variolation. And so this is an illustration from Indolio, which was this brief account of inducing pox. And in this you see that Shi, and I would say that this is perhaps the most important intervention, is that, remember I told you that variolation was through nasal insufflation at this point in time. And so the idea of making an incision into your arm and introducing animal matter into your arm was quite new in Chinese medicine. In fact, the incision into the arm was much newer in China, in Canton, than it was in Calcutta, where people were actually used to tikadars making incisions on their arms. response. But just kind of very quickly going through this, Indrajit, I see you, thank you, is that he introduces a theory of acupuncture, right? So it's an incision into the arm. The Chinese are used to meridian acupuncture. And so he basically embeds vaccination in terms of meridian acupuncture theory and says, well, actually vaccines for smallpox should happen at certain meridian points. Girls should be vaccinated on this arm, boys on the other. And so he kind of embeds, sinicizes, makes this link to cultural mores, rituals, traditions, and makes through acupuncture this kind of idea of a vaccine lancet entering your skin much more palatable and increases compliance. So very quickly in Calcutta, the messenger does not command trust, authority, or legitimacy. It is the proto-colonial government, really the company sarkar at this point in time. So it's not, so the messenger is not imbued with authority, neither, unfortunately, is the message. So this is the move from Warren Hastings really to Macaulay's minute, when we are going from the Oriental to the Occidentalists. And even though really the English had come and in Bengal were actively involved in the compilation of materia medicas to take back and inform their medicine, vaccine is really the first intervention that they have that is superior to these kind of traditional, backward, superstitious ways of the natives. And so vaccination is presented as a rejection, as a complete break from the existing treatments of smallpox. Variolation, which actually was up until then, English troops were being variolated. Now it was rejected as dangerous, as backward, as superstitious. And so vaccination, unlike in Canton and China more broadly, was presented as a complete break. There was no seasonality, no pre and post-op care, no propitiation of the goddess. It was rejected as backward and dangerous. And so now, unfortunately, most of my sources are really colonial documents at this point in time. And so they're laced with the racist judgments of the East India Company officers, such as the Money Brothers, who I showed you. But even in reading this colonial archive, you can see that vaccination is rejected because of the way in which it really is a break. It rejects, it's a rupture with existing cultural understandings. And so it's a cultural and a cognitive rupture. So vaccination, these are letters being sent to the kind of superintendents of vaccination from their workers, from the East India officers in the field. The principal objection is that it's done without any puja. Even David Arnold, who is a kind of exemplar of the subaltern studies school, talks about the ritualized practice of indigenous variolation as compared to the raw secularity of vaccination, such that vaccination begins to be seen as an attack on Sitala rather than a propitiation of the goddess. And just very quickly, David Arnold has this quite interesting passage in which he talks about when vaccination was accepted. It was basically done by being embedded. They chose an auspicious day, they observed old rituals and dietary taboos, they employed a pandit, they paid the vaccinator, the tikadar, to invoke Sitala rather than Jena Sahib for the child's safe passage. Very quickly, fast forward 100 years now, and we are in the mid-1970s, smallpox has been eradicated in much of the world, but it remains active in South Asia, which now becomes the locus of epidemiologists and public health workers. Again, this is Sanjay Bhattacharya's work, and they're all convening in India to try to kind of, get to the goal of smallpox zero. These are the kind of triumphant, heady days of global health. These are photographs from the archives of Larry Brilliant, who was very active at this time. The key thing is that even though this is the WHO, and even though these are foreign epidemiologists, of course, working with a cadre of highly committed Indian epidemiologists and public health workers, these teams reach out to local notables, to local religious leaders, in order to get their trust, their endorsement for the vaccination campaign. And they actively embed the smallpox vaccine and the WHO campaign as a propitiation of Sitala. They do this by setting up their vaccination camps within the premises of Sitala mandirs. The idea that, You might hide from the vaccinator, but you're not going to hide from Sitala if you have a case of smallpox in your family. And they used posters and a number of other propaganda, publicity, communication, persuasion tools to show themselves as working with, indeed, devotees of Sitala rather than working against her. So just very quickly, smallpox at this point in time has already been eradicated in China almost 20 years ago. And the way in which they do this is again by an endorsement through a trusted authority, in this case, the legitimacy of Mao with the anti-Japanese struggle and the rise of the CCP. So it's Mao at the central level and the CCP cadres, I go into this in much greater detail, who enjoy a great degree of trust and legitimacy at this point. And the way that they do it now is not so much as aligning it with traditional beliefs and worldviews, though that does also happen, but by tapping into a solidarity and we-ness. So this was the second set of moral motivations that I argue can be very important for compliance. And here the particular kind of solidarity that they tapped into was a territorial solidarity. It was nationalism. And so this has been my work I've done a lot of work on this, is how national solidarity and idea of we-ness is a powerful affective motivator. And again, the micro foundations of this go back to social identity theory and social psychology, that when we have a collective identity, we move from a me to a broader we identity. Individual interest is recast in collective terms, and this allows us to support collective action. And there's a wide body of empirical and theoretical research that shows how nationalism encourages the fulfillment of civic duties. So everything in that second column of the typology of state capacities, people who are more patriotic are more likely to vote, more likely to pay their taxes honestly, more likely to join the army, and more likely to vaccinate. And so here are some posters from the Patriotic Health Campaign in China in the 1950s, and smallpox vaccination was embedded and made a critical component of these patriotic health campaigns. And this is the anti-germ warfare, because remember, this is the context of the Korean War against the US. And so vaccinating yourself is a duty for the kind of nascent Chinese nation. It's a patriotic act to protect China against imperial foreign American germ warfare. And actually, interestingly, these posters, they kind of continue, a number of scholars of public health in China have shown, into posters that also are used against SARS and also against COVID. So because I know I'm probably right out of time, I'm going to just go over this very quickly, but just to kind of like give you just a little taste of the case illustration too. So far I spoke to you about coming up with this moral theory of development using variation in compliance with vaccination in China and India. I can also draw this theory from a second set of comparisons of social and education outcomes across Indian provinces. And here I really focus on the solidarity. So among these kind of moral motivations, I continue that emphasis, which I just spoke about, of solidarity. And so in the China material, I speak about how solidarity leads to greater popular cooperation. And in the subnational comparison of India, I have spoken about how a degree of solidarity, a we-ness, encourages state elites to put in place social policy. And the empirical comparison are these stark variations in social development outcomes within India. So Indian states share legal, electoral, and financial institutions, but they're worlds apart in social development. Some states do better than advanced industrialized countries. Other states do worse than countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Orissa on the eastern coast of India has a population size of Canada, and you're 5 times less likely to celebrate your first birthday than if you're in a state in the northeast of India. State of Bihar in the central west, really, it's considered part of the Hindi heartland. You're 4 times more likely, it's demographically the size of France, 4 times more likely to grow up illiterate in Bihar as compared to the state of Himachal. So huge variations within the single country in social development. And in my first book, I really tried to understand these sources of variation in education and health policies within India. And as the title indicates, I try to draw on how within a linguistic federation, India is a linguistic federation, states that have a much stronger sense of regional identity, which is a linguistic identity, they feel a sense of collective identity, a sense of we-ness. This sense of solidarity is a very important ethical, moral obligation and commitment for them to prioritize collective welfare, and in particular education and health policies. And so even though we have a very cynical view of elite behavior, I use archival work to show that in states that have a stronger sense of subnational solidarity, elites were more likely to push for social welfare, and people were more likely to support redistributive outcomes, and that together this leads to higher levels of social development. I have a statistical analysis as well as a comparative historical analysis in the book, but the one that is of course the starkest is Kerala and UP. It shows you here the drastic difference in female literacy rates. You're also, I think at some points in time during the 1950s, the life expectancy difference between a woman in Kerala and a woman in UP was almost 15 years. So just that accident of your birth, being born in the southern state of Kerala, made you likely to live 15 more years than if you were born in the rural countryside of UP. And I basically argue that this cannot be explained by those homo economicus type motivations, insofar as actually Uttar Pradesh was economically better off than Kerala in many of the years after independence. And instead, I argue that it was really the strong sense of Malayali subnationalism that drove the institution of progressive policy. And again, I do this in the book, and I would be thrilled if you might read it. But in Kerala, I argue, there's a single language. It's a common language. It's Malayalam. It's a distinctive language. No other state in India speaks Malayalam. Malayalam forms the basis for a common culture in Kerala around national art forms and festivals. So these are designated national festivals, national art forms. Interesting, of course, because the word in Kerala is Malayali nationalism. I use subnationalism simply analytically, not to in any way reduce it or as a diminutive, but only to distinguish it from Indian nationalism. But these cultural forms take active political manifestation in the Aikya Kerala movement during British colonialism. Kerala is divided across the princely states of Travancore, Cochin, and the directly controlled part of Malabar. This movement wants to coalesce Kerala on the basis of language. Everyone who speaks Malayalam should come together in the state of Kerala. And this movement is led by the Communist Party. It has a rich, really evocative, goosebump arousing literature about how there's one language, one nation, this idea of a united Kerala, a new Kerala. And many would argue that it was the Communist Party that played an important role in Kerala's exemplary social outcomes. And indeed, I don't disagree with that. I just simply look in the archives and interviews with Communist Party members to show that actually the Communist Party is as much a party of communism and much more a party of nationalism. So Namboodiripad, who's pictured there in that photograph, was a big patron of Malayali literature. And in as much as the Communist Party was translating Marx and Stalin and Lenin, they were really encouraging the development of Malayalam literature, the writings of histories, the myths of Kerala. And so I argue that the best way to see the Communist Party as distinguished from the Communist Party of Bengal is to see the Communist Party as really a Malayali subnationalist party that also headed the cause of the creation of Kerala. And I argue, in contrast, that UP has always been really ridden with conflict, the Hindi-Urdu conflict, which became a communal conflict. Nehru and Gandhi advocated for Hindustani as this kind of joint hybrid of spoken vernacular that should be both the language of India and also the language of UP. Instead, UP gets caught in this communal Muslim League partition language of Urdu written in Nastaliq as the language of Muslims, Hindi written in Devanagari as the language of the Hindus. So there is this politicization, communalization of language. There is no single common language. And even as they try to kind of, really push and beat these different dialects of Hindi to make it a kind of single language, many of those dialects are not mutually comprehensible, but also even if we think for a second, if we buy this fiction of Hindi being the common language of UP, it's not a distinctive language because every other neighboring state of UP also has Hindi as its common spoken language. This is a map from the late 1930s from a British census that talks about UP in terms of these cultural regions. At this point, of course, UP was the United Provinces. So very distinct cultures as compared to this kind of single actively constructed common culture in Kerala. Very interestingly, no state symbols. So this is, and I'm going to end very quickly. I'm always fascinated by this particular state symbol. So every state has a symbol in India, and this symbol is a very unwieldy symbol. If ever you happen to follow a car with license plates that are official license plates from UP, you'll notice that the actual number, the license number, is tiny because the state symbol takes up so much of the license plate. Ganesh Kudaisia has written quite effectively and wonderfully about this. And the reason is because they could not agree on a symbol. It shows you the kind of fractured nature of subnational identity. So they took the two symbols of the United Provinces of Agra and Awadh. So Agra, Ram Rajya, Ram, you have like Ram's bow, the bow and the arrow, and Awadh has the fish. And so rather than trying to come up with some kind of symbiosis or something that represents all of UP, they just basically just put together the two. Remember, UP is the only state that had a dissenting vote on the part of the States Reorganization Commission that was putting together linguistic provinces. They said UP should not be a single province. There's really nothing that holds it together. The state symbol is an indication of that. It's just the two mashed up together. The entire Constitution of India was held up because they could not agree on a name for UP. Sorry, I think I might have just skipped that over. But yeah, so these, for instance, are the many names that were considered for the state of UP. And because UP could not agree on its name, India's constitution could not be ratified because they needed to have a name for each province in India. And some of these names will give you an indication of the communal cleavages that had already begun to exist in UP, and of course are also very active today. And so Aryavrat, Awadh, Bharat, Nehru kept sending these back. And finally, Nehru, who of course was from UP himself, just gave up and said, you can just be Uttar Pradesh, which is really a geographic appellation, the northern provinces. And it's convenient because you continue your acronym, the United Provinces. But even the name of UP, the complete controversy and dissension on not being able to agree on a name. And when you come up with the name, it's either a highly Hinduized name, Nava-Hindu, Aryavrat, Brahmavrat, Brij Kaushal, or it is a name that signifies all of India, Hindustan, Hind, Bharat Khand. So UP has always had this kind of very fractured identity. On the one hand, it's about communal conflict or caste conflict. On the other hand, UP thinks it's India, that is UP. And so the main argument that I want to make is that, and of course, there's been a separatist movement. There's now a separate state of Uttarakhand that has been created in the last decade and a half from what was UP. The basic argument is that this cohesive Malayali identity pushed a politics of common welfare. In UP, religious nationalism led to a prioritization of sectional welfare over subnational education and health policy. And then finally, in the post-independence period, it was really this idea that UP embodied India. And so this is a cartoon by a wonderful cartoonist from India, Shankar, who in Shankar's Weekly said, a geographical exhibition has opened, you now know where UP is. And of course, it's a tongue-in-cheek mocking of the fact that UP really thought of itself as all of India. But this identification on the one hand with religion and caste, and on the other hand with the nation, prevented the emergence of any sort of solidarity or we-ness or oneness at the level of the province itself. And it is provinces, according to the Constitution of India, that have jurisdiction over education and health. And so as a result, you see a complete neglect of education and health in UP. And so because of this, you do not have, so the basic argument is that you do not have this sense of kind of moral motivation, because you do not have a sense of identification with this political community of UP. And now I'm not going to go over the statistical analysis, but instead to end by saying, so, you know, I've tried to present to you through these two sets of comparisons, the inadequacy and incompleteness of why it is that we can't just rely on Homo economicus driven understandings of human development. They're incomplete, but also they are in some ways much less, they do not do justice to who we are as humans. And so I argue that to effectively address the challenge of development, and I was really, it was so heartening to hear that Adrian Leftwich was really as much involved in actively furthering development. And so if we kind of shift to policies, in order to have better policies, better interventions against underdevelopment, we need to begin from a better understanding of who we are. And on the one hand is this humbler understanding, which has been focused on the fact that we are just mere mortals. We are not capable of being rational because of these different biases that we have, but instead to kind of move from that kind of humbler understanding to also a more richer understanding that we are mere mortals, but we are also moral mortals. We are driven by ideas of solidarity and we-ness and ethical obligations and shared identities. We're driven by ideas of trust, authority, legitimacy. And rather than bemoaning this fact, we can actually try to creatively harness it towards coming up with better interventions beyond incentives, information, compulsion, and nudges to really try to address this continued and shared challenge of underdevelopment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prerna. If we were in person, you'd probably get some sort of a standing ovation for the sweeping way in which you've covered what appear to be quite disparate and diverse topics, but you've sort of welded them together and woven them together so nicely. Thinking about comparative politics, thinking about state-society relations, along with moralities, along with affective identities, along with ideas of solidarity, we-ness, as you put it, I think does force us to challenge a lot of what we assume in the politics of development, as well as methodologically, I think, when we think about comparative politics, when we think about politics more broadly as a discipline. So I'm really, really pleased that you sort of, intervened in the ways that you did on this topic. I think there are some very obvious questions that emerge, and one question that's sort of come up, in terms of thinking about the idea of the sorts of solidarities that you mentioned. How could we constructively use them, as you plea in the end, in times that are so polarized as ours, where identities themselves form the basis of cleavage rather than sharing of the political community, if you will. And I guess this links to, in some ways, the very interesting ways in which you talked about the origins of the vaccination or the origins of ideas about disease. Surely there were differences, surely there were cleavages within society. So which versions prevailed, which versions didn't, I guess, is a question that, could be asked. And I guess if you could reflect, as the person has asked in the question, on how to, in some ways, reconcile solidarity with polarization, it would be helpful, I guess, to just kickstart some conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And you're absolutely, that's an excellent question, and I think a very urgent and topical one. So, the way that I think of identities sometimes is actually goes back to a book by Linda Colley, who's a historian of Britain, and she has this book called Britons. And in that, she has this analogy in which she says, identities are not like hats. We don't just wear one at once. And so to me, I think I kind of fall back on that in some ways when I begin to think about these kind of diverse identities and also polarized identities. Because I think in one way, and that analogy has basis in social psychology, which, as you can tell, I kind of draw upon quite heavily, in that there is this model within social identity theory. So, we know from generations of laboratory and field experiments that being put in a common group encourages people to have more positive attitudes and behavior towards that group, even when that group is quite minimally defined. Kandinsky lovers versus Klee lovers is a classic experiment by Henri Tachfel. But I think that the key thing for me is that you can have those positive effects of group identity even when you bring together people who might previously have thought of themselves as us and them. So they've done these experiments in which they call this the common in-group identity model. And they say, you bring people together and then you give them a shared superordinate identity. So going back to Linda Colley, it's not that you stop being a member of a certain group. It's not that I stop being a Hindu or an upper caste or a woman. It's that I get this kind of shared identity that is layered onto it. And so this superordinate identity kind of blurs the us and the them into this kind of general idea of a we. And I didn't get an opportunity to refer to it, but I have an article in a journal called Comparative Political Studies, in which we tried to do this with Indian nationalism. Of course, this was pre-Modi. And so I do sometimes wonder and despair whether we would have gotten the same results if we did it today. But back in 2012, with 2 graduate students at Harvard, where I was an assistant professor at the time, we basically showed people in an online survey experiment either a map of India or not a map of India. And we got them to do the same task, which was a task of contributing money that they were earning for doing this kind of quiz. We asked them whether they would contribute this money to Muslim or Hindu victims of a fire accident. And we manipulated the names to either be Ram or Muhammad as standing in for these victims. And we found that exposure to the Indian tricolor and to this map of India it eliminated the pro-in-group bias. So in the control group, the sample was mostly upper caste Hindus. And so these upper caste Hindus did in the control group discriminate in their giving against Muslims, but exposure to something as subliminal and subtle as the flag of India, just in the corner, almost like a letterhead, actually eliminated this difference and made them more likely to engage in pro-social giving. And it wasn't cheap talk, it was actually money that they were contributing, small amounts of money. And so, I don't mean to dodge this question about polarization, because both in India and in the US, where I am today, those identities have